The cold void of space was vast and endless, its silence broken only by the faint hum of dying engines. Above the barren moon, a battle was raging, an entire fleet of advanced alien warships engaged in a vicious assault. The stars, once brilliant, were obscured by the blackened smoke of warships falling to the surface. On the ground, everything that had once been beautiful and full of life was now reduced to ashes. Among the chaos, Lyra, the last remaining member of a once proud royal family, stumbled through the wreckage, her breath ragged, her body weak. She had been abandoned. Once she had been the princess of a powerful alien race, revered by her people, her kingdom alive with technology and prosperity. But now, her planet was nothing more than a shadow of its former self. Lyra's life had been shattered by a coup. The very people she had sworn to protect turning against her. They had cast her aside, blaming her for their downfall. A broken world, a broken heart. Lyra had nothing left. No allies, no family, and no hope. She was alone, wandering this desolate moon with nothing but the remnants of her royal garb and the faint memories of what she had lost. The day had started like any other, but it quickly became a nightmare. She was forced to flee her people, chased by her enemies. The warships that once protected her had abandoned her too, their cloaking devices rendering them invisible, leaving her vulnerable to the wrath of the alien forces. There was no escape. Her escape pod had been destroyed. Her path forward was blocked by a never-ending storm of alien ships. The moon she had been forced to land on was desolate, its surface cracked and lifeless. She had hoped to find refuge, but there was none to be found. She had become a ghost, a forgotten princess in a forgotten world. For hours, she wandered the moon's surface, too weak to fight back, too tired to care. Her once proud face, adorned with the markings of her royal bloodline, was now smeared with dirt and blood. She had been betrayed by her people, left to die alone, and it seemed the universe itself had turned its back on her. The once mighty princess was now nothing more than a shadow, a relic of a dying species. The moon was eerily silent, the only sound the faint whispers of the wind. Lyra stumbled over jagged rocks, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Every step felt like it could be her last. She was so tired, so broken. She couldn't remember how long she had been wandering, how many hours had passed since she had last spoken to anyone. Her heart ached with the weight of the betrayal, the sting of rejection still fresh. She had done nothing wrong. All she had ever wanted was to help her people, to bring peace to her world. And yet, they had cast her aside, left her to die on this barren rock. Lyra's vision blurred, her knees buckling beneath her. She collapsed onto the ground, her body shaking with exhaustion. She had no energy left, no will to fight. She closed her eyes, the darkness of the moon's surface swallowing her whole. But just as she was about to give in to the overwhelming emptiness, a sound reached her ears, a faint rustle, the crunch of boots on the rocky ground. Someone was here. She opened her eyes, her heart racing. She was not alone. But who could it be? Was it another enemy, come to finish what had been started? Or could it be? She didn't have the strength to hope, but a part of her prayed that it wasn't too late. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the figure step into view, a human soldier. His armor was battered, his face hidden behind a visor, but there was no mistaking the human insignia on his chest. She had heard of humans, weak, fragile creatures who had no place in the universe's greater schemes. But this human was different. He was taller than most of her kind, broad-shouldered, and his movements were swift and calculated. His eyes, though obscured by the helmet, seemed to hold something she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. The human soldier didn't hesitate. He rushed to her side, kneeling beside her as if she were not the princess of a fallen kingdom, but simply a person in need. He didn't see her as royalty. He didn't see her as a princess or a queen. He saw her as a woman who had lost everything, someone deserving of compassion. In that moment, Lyra felt something stir within her, something she hadn't felt since her kingdom had fallen. Her chest heaved with the effort to speak. Who "Who are you?" The human soldier didn't answer immediately. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder, checking her wounds. His movements were precise, professional, and despite the chaos of the situation, he seemed calm, almost detached. His voice finally broke through the haze of her exhaustion. "Does it matter?" he asked, his tone rough but not unkind. "You need help, and I'm here to give it." Lyra wanted to protest. She wanted to tell him that he was wasting his time, that there was no hope left for her, for anyone. But something about his words, the sincerity in his voice, made her pause. She had nothing left to lose, and yet she found herself trusting him in a way she couldn't explain. The human soldier pulled a med kit from his pack and began to treat her wounds. His touch was careful, but there was a sense of urgency to it. The battle was still raging above, and time was running out. Lyra couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief, as though his presence was a lifeline she didn't know she needed. He was human, fragile, small, and yet here he was, standing between her and certain death. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why help me? I'm nothing." The soldier paused for a moment, then finished wrapping her arm in bandages. "Because everyone deserves a chance," he replied, looking her in the eyes for the first time. "Even you." The words struck her deeply, a soft warmth spreading through her chest. Could it be? Could someone like him, someone from a race so different from her own, actually care about her well-being? She had been betrayed by her own people, her own flesh and blood. And yet this human, someone she had been taught to see as inferior, was showing her kindness when no one else would. It didn't make sense. The soldier helped her to her feet, his arm steadying her as she wobbled. "You're not alone," he said quietly. "I won't leave you behind." Not like they did. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lyra allowed herself to hope. She was not alone. Not anymore. She wasn't sure what the future held or what would come next, but in that moment, standing beside the human soldier, she realized something. She still had a chance. The universe hadn't abandoned her completely. Maybe, just maybe, this human would be the key to unlocking the path she needed to reclaim her life, her kingdom, and her people. And in that moment, the first spark of change was born. Lyra blinked, still trying to comprehend the situation. She had been stranded in the middle of nowhere, utterly alone, for what seemed like an eternity. Now, in a strange twist of fate, a human soldier had appeared from the darkness of space, saving her life in a world where no one else cared enough to look for her. He wasn't part of the alien forces that had destroyed her kingdom, nor was he another soldier sent to finish her off. He was different. He was kind. As she stood shakily, with his hand supporting her, she looked up at him, her mind still clouded with confusion. He was taller than most of her species, his broad shoulders giving off the aura of strength, but there was a certain gentleness in his actions as he guided her forward. His face was hidden behind a sleek visor, but she could tell from his movements that he was highly trained, professional, calculated, and yet somehow unshaken by the chaos around them. It was almost as if he had seen things far worse than what was happening right now, and nothing could break him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse, her words barely audible against the winds that howled across the barren moon. Her heart still pounded in her chest, and her mind raced with questions. Why was he here? What was his purpose? Surely, a human soldier had no business on this forsaken moon. There was no reason for him to be here, and no reason for him to help her, a failed princess of a destroyed race. But yet, here he was, saving her life. The soldier didn't respond at first. Instead, he looked out into the distance, his body tense, scanning the horizon as though expecting something, or someone, to appear. His hand remained firm on her shoulder, steadying her as they moved forward. "You're lucky I found you," he finally said, his voice rough but steady. "This moon is a dead zone. You won't survive here for long unless you get off it." Lyra nodded weakly, still unable to wrap her mind around what was happening. She had been abandoned to die, forgotten by her own people, only to be found by this human. She felt a strange sense of gratitude for him, mixed with an odd sense of guilt. He was risking his life to help someone like her, a princess from a fallen race, a mere survivor in a universe that had cast her aside. Why would he help someone like her? Her thoughts were interrupted when the soldier suddenly stopped, crouching down next to a small, concealed hatch in the ground. Lyra watched him as he expertly began to open it, his movements smooth, efficient. Within moments, a narrow underground tunnel was revealed. "We need to move quickly," he said, looking up at her with a steady gaze. "The rest of the fleet could be here any minute. We don't want to be around when they arrive." She hesitated, glancing back at the barren landscape. The moon stretched out before her, desolate and silent. It had once been a place of life and beauty, but now it was a tomb, its surface scarred by the conflict that had ravaged her world. There was no going back. She had no choice but to follow this human soldier, someone who had somehow become her lifeline in the middle of the chaos. She stepped forward, moving with him into the tunnel. The air inside was stale, but the walls seemed to hum with energy, as though the tunnel had been designed for something far more advanced than anything she had ever seen. Lyra couldn't help but wonder how this human had come to be on this desolate moon. What was his purpose here? Was he part of the human military forces, or had he been sent by someone else? Whatever the answer, she didn't have the strength to ask questions right now. The tunnel was narrow, the walls lined with strange markings she didn't recognize. The soldier moved ahead, his steps echoing in the quiet passage, his figure illuminated only by the soft glow of the lights along the walls. Lyra followed, trying to keep her balance as she stumbled along behind him. Despite her exhaustion, something about the soldier's presence made her feel safer, as though she was no longer alone in a world that had forgotten her. Eventually, the tunnel led them to a small underground chamber, its walls lined with more advanced technology. Lyra's eyes widened in surprise. She had seen the alien technologies that her people had used, but nothing like this. The walls were covered with intricate designs, and in the center of the room, a large console stood, humming softly with life. "This is where I was stationed," the soldier said, walking over to the console and tapping a few buttons. "I've been working on a way to get off this moon for a while. Now that you're here, we'll need to move quickly." Lyra looked around, still trying to process everything. "You've been here, alone." The soldier paused for a moment, glancing over his shoulder at her. His voice softened slightly. "I'm not alone anymore, am I?" The simple words struck her harder than she expected. She had been alone for so long, abandoned by everyone she had ever known, that the idea of someone actually wanting to help her was almost foreign. And yet this human soldier was here, giving her his attention and care when no one else had. Her heart fluttered, but she quickly pushed the feeling away. She couldn't afford to let herself feel anything, not now. Not when everything was so uncertain. "What's the plan?" she asked, trying to focus on the immediate danger. The soldier turned back to the console and began typing, his fingers moving with precision. "We're going to use the shuttle," he said without looking up. "It's a small transport, but it's fast. It's the only way we're getting off this moon before the alien forces get here." Lyra nodded, still not fully trusting the situation. She had seen too many betrayals, too many false promises to believe that someone like him, someone she had just met, would truly help her. But as he worked, his determination was clear. He wasn't just helping her out of pity. He was helping her because he believed it was the right thing to do. Before long, the soldier finished inputting the final commands, and the console came to life, a map of the moon appearing on the screen. He looked back at her, his expression serious. "The shuttle is ready. We need to get to it before the forces arrive. Are you ready?" Lyra took a deep breath, her heart racing with anticipation. The weight of everything she had lost, her kingdom, her family, her people, felt heavy on her shoulders, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. This human soldier, this stranger, was offering her a way out. It was all she had left. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. With that, the soldier led her out of the chamber and back into the narrow tunnel. The sound of their footsteps echoed around them as they made their way toward the shuttle. Lyra's mind raced as she thought about what was to come. Would this human really be able to protect her? Would they escape the alien forces in time? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. All she could do now was move forward. And for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope deep within her. As they reached the shuttle, the soldier stopped for a moment, turning to look at her one last time. "We're in this together now," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "I won't let anything happen to you. We'll get through this." And with that, they boarded the shuttle, leaving the moon behind. For Lyra, the journey had only just begun, but one thing was certain: she was no longer alone. She had a human by her side, and together they would face whatever came next. The shuttle's engines hummed steadily as they cut through the void of space, leaving the lifeless moon behind. Lyra sat in the back, her mind still racing, trying to piece together the whirlwind of events that had brought her here. Just hours ago, she had been abandoned, a forgotten princess, stranded on a desolate world, left to die by her own people. Now she was in a small shuttle, flying through the stars, with a human soldier by her side. Lyra's eyes scanned the interior of the shuttle, taking in the advanced technology that surrounded her. This human, despite being just one soldier in a war that spanned across galaxies, had a ship that seemed far beyond anything her people had ever designed. The controls were sleek, digital interfaces glowing softly in the dim light of the shuttle. Everything was built for speed and efficiency. Even the way the shuttle glided through space felt different. There was a fluidity to it, like a predator on the hunt, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Beside her, the soldier remained quiet, his focus on the controls ahead. He hadn't spoken much since they left the moon, his expression serious and intent on navigating the vastness of space. Lyra wanted to ask him questions, so many questions, but the words didn't come. She wasn't sure where to start, or if she even had the right to ask. After all, he had just saved her life. He didn't owe her an explanation. He didn't owe her anything. And yet she felt compelled to know more about him, about why he was doing this for her, why he, a human, had gone out of his way to help someone like her. The silence between them stretched on, uncomfortable yet strangely calming. It wasn't that the soldier seemed distant, quite the opposite, in fact. His presence, though quiet, felt reassuring. It was as if he was someone she could rely on, even though she knew nothing about him. His eyes, though hidden behind a visor, conveyed a sense of determination. His movements, though measured, exuded a quiet confidence. He wasn't someone who would back down, not in the face of danger, not in the face of the unknown. Finally, unable to keep the question swirling in her mind any longer, Lyra spoke. Her voice was tentative at first, unsure of how to broach the subject. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her words simple but filled with uncertainty. The soldier didn't answer immediately, as though weighing her question carefully. His fingers tapped lightly on the console, the soft sound of his touch, the only noise that filled the shuttle's interior. After a moment, he turned his head slightly, his voice calm but direct. "I don't leave people behind," he said simply. "Not if I can help it." Lyra frowned, unsure of how to interpret his words. It was a simple answer, yet it spoke volumes. He wasn't here because it was his duty, or because someone had ordered him to help her. He was here because he genuinely believed in doing the right thing. In a universe so consumed by war and betrayal, that kind of honesty was rare. "You don't know anything about me," Lyra murmured. "I could be a danger to you. My people, my race. We've done terrible things. I've done terrible things." The soldier's hands remained steady on the controls, but his voice softened as he spoke. "I've seen worse. I've fought worse. You're not what I'm worried about." Lyra's breath hitched slightly at his words. She wasn't used to hearing compassion in the voices of strangers, especially not from someone like him, but human. Humans were the ones her people had tried to conquer, to dominate. And now, here she was, relying on one to protect her. It felt like the universe had turned everything upside down, and she couldn't make sense of it. "You don't have to help me," she said quietly, her voice carrying a mix of gratitude and guilt. "I don't deserve it." The soldier didn't respond to her words. Instead, he shifted slightly, adjusting the controls. His silence was not dismissive, but rather, it seemed as though he was giving her space to process her emotions. He wasn't here to force her into anything, or to push her beyond what she was capable of. He was simply here, and that was enough for now. The shuttle continued to cruise through the vast expanse of space, its engines purring softly as the stars streaked past them. Lyra leaned back in her seat, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. She had no plan, no direction. She was lost, both literally and figuratively. Her kingdom was gone, her people scattered and broken. She had nothing left but the clothes on her back and the human soldier beside her. As the minutes passed, Lyra began to feel a strange sense of safety. She had been abandoned for so long that the idea of being cared for by someone, anyone, seemed foreign to her. But here, with this soldier, she felt as though she wasn't alone anymore. It was an unsettling feeling, but also one she couldn't deny. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax, to breathe. It wasn't long before the silence was broken again, this time by the soldier's voice, which was surprisingly gentle. "Where do you want to go?" he asked. Lyra looked up at him, her mind still foggy from the trauma of her escape. She had no idea where to go, no idea what to do next. She could feel the weight of her people's expectations pressing down on her, but she couldn't live in the past anymore. It was clear that whatever future she had now, it would have to be built with new foundations, one she would need to discover for herself. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice small but steady. "I don't know where I belong anymore." The soldier nodded, as if understanding more than she expected. He didn't press her for an answer, didn't try to offer her false comfort. Instead, he simply allowed the question to linger in the air, letting it settle into the quiet hum of the shuttle. "I've got a few ideas," he said after a long pause. "But first, we need to get somewhere safe, somewhere we can lay low, at least for a while." Lyra looked out of the window, gazing at the swirling expanse of stars that seemed to stretch on forever. In that moment, she realized that the universe was vast, far bigger than she had ever known. Her world, her struggles, her identity, all of it seemed so small now, so insignificant against the backdrop of the galaxy. But she was alive, and she wasn't alone. Maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. "We'll figure it out," she said, more to herself than to him. The soldier glanced at her, his lips quirking slightly upward beneath his visor. "Yeah, we will." For the first time since the destruction of her home, Lyra felt a glimmer of hope. The human soldier, this stranger who had saved her life, wasn't just offering her refuge from her enemies. He was offering her something far more important. He was offering her the chance to start again. And in that moment, she realized something. It wasn't the galaxy or the stars that defined her future. It was the choices she made, the alliances she formed, and the people she allowed herself to trust. This human, this soldier, might just be the person who helped her rebuild what had been lost. As the shuttle continued its journey through the stars, Lyra allowed herself to believe that anything was possible. Together, they might just change the course of history. The days that followed their escape were a blur of constant movement. The shuttle, now equipped with minimal supplies, and the soldiers' well-honed survival instincts, cut through the cold expanse of space at high speed, weaving between asteroids and hidden pockets of debris. Lyra sat beside the soldier, her mind still adjusting to this new reality. She had been on the run for so long, always afraid of the next threat, the next betrayal. But here, in the presence of this soldier, she began to feel something she had long forgotten. hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her moving forward. They hadn't spoken much in the days since the shuttle left the desolate moon. There was a comfort in their silence, an unspoken understanding between them. The soldier, whose name Lyra had only recently learned was called Jack, didn't ask her about her past, and she didn't feel the need to volunteer the painful details. They both understood that there were things best left unsaid. For Lyra, every passing moment in the shuttle felt like a reprieve from the chaos she had left behind. The world she had known, a world of intrigue, betrayal, and power, seemed like a distant memory, a life she no longer recognized. She was no longer a princess, no longer the center of a crumbling empire. She was just a woman, lost and alone, with nothing left to offer except her survival instinct. But Jack had offered her something else, something more. It was clear by the way he operated, by the way he handled himself, that he had seen things, done things that she couldn't even begin to imagine. His movements were always precise, calculated, as though every action had a purpose. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was always something meaningful, always a piece of knowledge, or a lesson he was imparting, often without realizing it. Lyra was beginning to understand that Jack wasn't just some soldier. He was someone who had been through his own battles, his own wars, someone who had fought for survival just as much as she had. After a few days of travel, they reached their first destination, a small, seemingly uninhabited planet on the outskirts of a distant star system. It was barely more than a barren rock, covered in jagged cliffs and dusty plains, but it offered something vital: isolation. There was no sign of any hostile ships, no signs of alien patrols that could catch their scent. Jack landed the shuttle near a small cavern hidden beneath a rocky outcrop. As the engines powered down, the low hum of the shuttle ceased, leaving only the distant sound of wind whipping through the cliffs outside. Lyra stepped out of the shuttle and took a deep breath, her chest rising with the cool, thin air. The planet felt empty, almost lifeless, and in a strange way, it was exactly what they needed. Jack began unloading supplies from the shuttle. "We'll stay here for a while," he said, his voice steady. "There's a settlement on the other side of the planet. We can resupply, get more information on the local traffic routes. But for now, we need to keep low." Lyra nodded. She understood. For the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of the reality they were facing. The world had changed, and she wasn't the one in control anymore. She was the one who needed saving, the one who needed protection. Jack worked quickly, setting up a small perimeter around their shelter. His eyes never stopped scanning the horizon, always on alert. Lyra helped where she could, but she knew her skills were limited. Her training had been more about diplomacy and leadership, not survival. She had been prepared to command an empire, not to fight for her life. But she had learned, over the past few days, that survival wasn't about brute force or strategy. It was about adaptability. It was about learning to trust the people around you, to rely on them when you couldn't rely on yourself. And for the first time in a long while, she was beginning to trust Jack. The first night they spent on the barren planet was quiet. There was no wildlife, no sounds of civilization, just the wind, the stars, and the faint, distant hum of the shuttle systems keeping them alive. As Lyra sat by the fire, her eyes tracing the stars above them, she realized how far they had come since that first moment when Jack had saved her life. Her thoughts were interrupted when Jack approached, sitting down beside her. He didn't speak at first, just sat there, staring at the fire. Lyra was about to say something when he spoke, his voice low and calm. "Tomorrow, we go into the settlement," he said. "We need to find out what's going on. If anyone's tracking us, if anyone knows who you are." Lyra nodded. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the best they could do. She had no idea who might be after her, or if there were still people loyal to her family out there. The galaxy was vast, and the possibility that someone might still be hunting her was a constant, nagging fear. "We'll be careful," she said softly. "But what if we're not enough? What if we can't stay hidden?" Jack's eyes flicked to her, a glimmer of something unreadable in his gaze. Then we fight. We adapt. We survive. Lyra met his gaze, surprised by the quiet conviction in his words. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a survivor. And for some reason, that was the reassurance she needed. The next day, they ventured toward the settlement. The journey wasn't long, but every step felt heavier than the last. They moved in silence, keeping to the shadows as they approached the small cluster of buildings on the horizon. The settlement was nothing special. A few huts, a small marketplace, and a rundown cantina where weary travelers went to rest. It was a place that had seen better days, but it was just the kind of place where people came to disappear. Jack led the way, his movements precise, careful. Lyra stayed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. As they reached the outskirts of the settlement, Jack paused, scanning the area. "There's a local shop around the corner," he said. "We can get supplies there, maybe some information. Stay close." Lyra followed him, trying to steady her breathing. They entered the shop, a dimly lit place filled with a strange assortment of goods from all corners of the galaxy. Jack went to the counter, exchanging a few words with the owner, who gave him a nod and handed over some basic supplies. Lyra watched, her mind racing as she tried to pick up any clues from the conversation. Jack returned to her, a small bag of supplies in his hand. "We'll be fine for now, but we can't stay long." As they turned to leave, Lyra caught sight of something out of the corner of her eye. A group of figures in the distance, moving quickly, their silhouettes just visible against the backdrop of the settlement. For a brief moment, her heart skipped a beat. Were they being followed? Had someone recognized her? But Jack was already moving, pulling her gently back toward the shadows, his hand gripping her arm with firm reassurance. "We're not alone," he whispered, his voice low. "But we're not vulnerable either. Stay close." They moved swiftly, blending into the crowd, the tension in the air thickening with every step. Lyra's thoughts were scattered, but one thing was clear. This was the moment that would define everything. They had the chance to turn the tide, to fight back against whatever threats lay ahead. And together, they would face whatever came their way. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming what had been lost. And as Lyra glanced at Jack, she knew, deep in her heart, that this was just the beginning. Lyra stood on the edge of the makeshift camp, her gaze piercing the horizon. As the sun began to dip beneath the jagged peaks of the barren world they had made their temporary home, the sounds of the rebellion, of people training, of weapons being sharpened, faded into the background as her thoughts swirled. The universe, once filled with the bustling of her empire, now felt hollow. She had lost everything: her throne, her family, her identity. But now, after months of struggle, something was finally beginning to shift. Thanks to Daniel, Lyra had learned what it meant to truly fight. It wasn't just about honor, about war strategies taught by generals who'd never felt the sting of betrayal. No, Daniel had taught her something different. He had shown her how to use tactics that didn't rely on superior technology, but on raw determination, the very same determination that had kept him alive through battles far greater than the one they were now about to face. The camp had grown in numbers since their arrival. At first, it was just a handful of survivors, refugees from her fallen empire, people who had lost everything and had nowhere else to turn. They were scattered, afraid, not knowing how to fight back against an empire as advanced and ruthless as the one that had crushed her. But with each passing day, Lyra had seen their resolve grow. She had begun to teach them, slowly at first, showing them how to blend their skills and knowledge with the guerrilla tactics Daniel had passed on to her. The once weak and disorganized group was now starting to come together as something more. They were becoming a force. And it wasn't just Lyra's leadership that had done this. It was the way Daniel had led by example, training them, sharing his knowledge, showing them the strength they didn't know they had. It had all come together in a way Lyra never imagined possible. "Ready for today?" Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts. He stood behind her, his posture relaxed, but there was a sharpness in his eyes, a sign that he was always watching, always ready. Lyra turned to face him, her lips curling into a faint smile. The connection between them had grown over the weeks, and despite their constant tension, there was something unspoken between them that neither could ignore. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I think they are too." Daniel nodded, his eyes scanning the camp. The rebellion had been small at first, but now it was beginning to look like something real, something that could take on the forces of the alien empire. Each day, Lyra saw the people around her begin to understand that they could fight back, that they could take control of their fate again. The plan was simple, or at least it had started that way. They would hit the empire where it hurt the most, its supply lines. They had already gathered enough information to know that the empire had been relying on a series of secretive transport routes, bringing in resources and reinforcements from far-flung systems. The rebellion had the advantage of knowing the terrain, knowing how to stay hidden, and most importantly, knowing the empire's weaknesses. The rebellion's strength didn't lie in its numbers, but in its ability to act where the empire least expected it. As they moved out that day, Daniel by her side, Lyra couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement mixed with anxiety. This was it, the moment they had all been working for, the first strike against the empire. A chance to remind the galaxy that Lyra was still alive, still fighting, still worthy of her place as its ruler. She couldn't fail. Not now, when everything she had worked for was within reach. The strike was swift, a coordinated attack on one of the Empire's smaller supply bases. The rebellion hit with precision, taking out the guards and disabling the transport vehicles before the enemy even had a chance to retaliate. It was a perfect hit, one that sent a ripple of shock through the Empire's intelligence network. For Lyra, it was the moment she realized the true power of what they were building. The resistance wasn't just about her reclaiming her throne. It was about giving these people, her people, something they had lost. It was about restoring hope to a galaxy that had been dominated by fear for so long. Back at the camp, the survivors erupted in celebration. Lyra stood at the edge, watching as the people who had once been too afraid to even pick up a weapon now stood together, victorious. But amid the celebration, Lyra couldn't ignore the pull in her chest. The mission was successful, yes, but there was still so much left to do. The Empire had been dealt a blow, but they were far from finished. And there was something else, something she hadn't quite allowed herself to acknowledge. The closer she grew to Daniel, the more conflicted she became. She had never trusted humans, not after everything that had happened to her, not after how they had played her and her people for fools. But Daniel was different. In the chaos of war, amidst all the fighting and fear, he had become her anchor. He had saved her life when she was at her lowest, when she had nothing left. And now, in the midst of this rebellion, he was more than just her ally. He was someone she couldn't imagine being without. But she couldn't let herself feel too much. Not yet. Not with everything at stake. Her duty was to her people, to her throne. There could be no distractions. As the days passed, the rebellion's successes grew. Small victories, like the one they had just completed, began to snowball. More and more systems that had once bowed to the alien empire were starting to see the resistance as a legitimate force, not just a small group of rebels hiding in the shadows. Lyra's leadership had become a beacon of hope, and the people around her, people like Daniel, had come to see her not just as a fallen princess, but as a symbol of resistance. Yet, despite their success, there was a heavy silence between Lyra and Daniel. The weight of their unspoken bond seemed to grow with each passing day. As they sat together one evening, overlooking the fire that flickered in the center of the camp, Lyra finally broke the silence. "I never believed in the goodness of humans," she admitted softly, her eyes locked on the flames. "Not after what they did to me, to my people. But with you, I see something different, something I didn't think was possible." Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were filled with understanding. He had known this moment was coming. The truth was, He had seen something in her from the beginning, something that no one else had. Lyra wasn't just a princess, she was a fighter. And that strength was what had drawn him to her in the first place. "You've always had that strength," he said quietly, his voice low but steady. "You've just had to remember it. And now you're giving others the chance to do the same." Daniel's hand, almost instinctively, found hers. His grip was firm, grounding her in a way she couldn't explain. "I'll always be here, Lyra. Always." The night passed in silence, but the air between them was thick with something more than just the tension of the rebellion. It was the understanding that, despite the odds, they had each other, and that made them stronger than they had ever been before. The rebellion was rising, and with it, the hope of reclaiming what had once been lost. The final battle was fast approaching, and Lyra and Daniel, despite the unspoken bond that had formed between them, knew that the stakes were higher than ever. The war was far from over, but together, they were ready to face whatever came their way. The time had come. The final confrontation with the alien empire was imminent. All the preparations, all the struggles, and the sacrifices led to this one moment. Lyra stood at the forefront of the rebellion, her heart pounding in her chest as she surveyed the alien stronghold in the distance. This wasn't just a battle for power. It was a battle for the future of her people, her planet, and everything she had once been. She had risen from nothing, a forgotten princess, and now she stood as the leader of a movement that could bring the alien empire to its knees. Around her, the rebels were ready. Their faces were marked with determination, their eyes steely with resolve. They had come a long way from the days of hiding in the shadows. Together, they were about to face the most formidable force the galaxy had ever known. Daniel was at her side, as always, his hand resting on his weapon. He had become more than just an ally. He had become her equal. In the trenches, during the long days of training, and through the trials they had faced together, Lyra had come to trust him with her life. But now, the stakes were higher than ever before. The final showdown would either bring their freedom or destroy everything they had fought for. The air was thick with anticipation as the fleet of rebel ships moved into position. They were ready to strike, but the alien empire was prepared as well. The enemy had cloaking devices, advanced weaponry, and the element of surprise on their side. The sky above them darkened as the rebellion's forces began their assault, the first shots fired from the ships lighting up the heavens in a burst of blinding light. The fight was on. Lyra's heart raced as the orbital bombardment began. The skies above the enemy stronghold erupted with explosions, the ground shaking as the Empire's defenses were ripped apart. But the cloaking devices quickly rendered the rebellion's attacks ineffective, masking the movement of enemy forces. It was a tactic they had been preparing for, but facing it in real time was different from any training they had done. "Stay sharp," Daniel's voice was calm but firm, cutting through the chaos. "They'll try to hit us from every direction. We've trained for this, but we need to work together." Lyra nodded, her grip tightening on her blaster. She wasn't just leading this battle. She was fighting it alongside every rebel who had put their faith in her. The alien emperor, the one who had taken everything from her, was holed up in the heart of the stronghold. That's where they would end this. The ground forces surged forward, pushing past the defenses of the Empire. The rebels were moving quickly, adapting to the chaotic environment, their movements synchronized. Lyra moved with them, using the skills Daniel had taught her. Strategic, quick, and calculated. Her people were following her lead, each one more confident than the last, their hopes resting on her ability to lead them to victory. They reached the heart of the stronghold, the final barrier before the Emperor's command center. The battle was fierce, the air crackling with energy as blaster fire whizzed past them. Lyra's heart pounded in her ears, but her focus never wavered. She had trained for this moment, and now it was here. As they stormed the stronghold, the last line of defense fell. The alien Emperor's guards, once an imposing force, were now scattered and retreating. The path to the throne room was clear. It was time. Lyra turned to him then, her gaze meeting his, her heart racing in her chest. There was a vulnerability in her eyes now, one that she hadn't shown before. "And what about you, Daniel?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where do you fit into all of this? In all of this chaos, I've come to realize I need you. I need you by my side. You've always been there for me, and I don't know how I can fight this battle without you." Lyra pushed forward, her body moving on instinct. Her footsteps were steady, and as they neared the door to the Emperor's chamber, she could feel the weight of everything that had led them here. The final confrontation wasn't just with the Emperor. It was with the Empire that had stolen her birthright, destroyed her people, and crushed everything she had once known. She stepped into the Emperor's chamber, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. There, standing at the center of the room, was the alien Emperor. His tall, imposing figure glowed with an eerie light, his eyes cold and calculating. He had been the one to bring her world to ruin. And now, she was here to take everything back. "I knew you would come," the Emperor said, his voice booming, echoing through the chamber. "But you will fail, just as you failed before. Your people are weak. And now, you are too." Lyra's gaze hardened as she stepped forward, her stance unwavering. "You may have taken everything from me, but you will not take my people. You will not take my world." The battle that followed was intense. The Emperor wielded advanced alien technology, armor that could withstand even the most powerful strikes and energy weapons that seemed to distort the air itself. But Lyra was no longer the young, helpless princess who had been betrayed. She had learned, adapted, and become a warrior in her own right. The Emperor's power, his technology, was no match for the strength of her resolve. With every strike, Lyra felt the weight of her past, the betrayal, the pain, the loss, dissipate. She was no longer a victim. She was a force of her own, one that could not be easily defeated. As the battle raged on, she finally found her opening. With a precise strike, she disabled the Emperor's weapon, leaving him vulnerable. With a final powerful blow, she brought him to his knees, the weight of the rebellion's victory crushing down on him. The Emperor's once imposing form crumbled, and with it, the empire that had oppressed her people for so long. The room was silent except for the sounds of Lyra's ragged breathing. It was over. The rebellion had won. But the cost had been high. As Lyra emerged from the chamber, her eyes scanning the wreckage, she saw the faces of her people, victorious but weary. Many had fallen in the battle. Many lives had been lost for this moment of triumph. The rebellion had won, but the scars of the war would remain forever. Lyra turned to Daniel, her heart heavy. He had been with her every step of the way, from the first days of their alliance to the final battle. He had fought beside her, taught her, and kept her grounded when everything felt like it was falling apart. But now, with the battle won, there was nothing left for him to do here. "Thank you," Lyra said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. But beneath it, there was something softer, a recognition of what they had been through together. "You did it, Lyra. You led them. You led us all to victory." There was a long silence between them as they shared a final, understanding look. Lyra had come to realize that Daniel's presence in her life had been more than just a means to an end. He had become a part of her, someone who had shown her what it meant to truly fight for what mattered. But now, with the Empire defeated, it was time for him to return to Earth. His mission was complete. The galaxy had been saved, and Lyra's throne had been restored. "I'll never forget you," Lyra said quietly, her eyes searching his. "You'll be a great queen," Daniel replied, his voice thick with emotion. "The galaxy will remember you." With that, Daniel turned, walking away from the woman who had become so much more than a symbol of resistance. As he boarded the transport ship that would take him back to Earth, he looked back one last time, knowing that their lives would never be the same. Back on the throne, Lyra's heart was heavy. She had won, but the cost had been immense. Still, she stood tall, her people cheering as they rallied behind her. As the new queen of her people, she would rebuild their world, her past erased by the fires of the rebellion, and her future now secured by the courage of those who had fought by her side. Looking out at the stars, Lyra knew one thing for certain: humanity had saved her, and with their help, she would lead her people to a new age of peace and prosperity. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Lyra's redemption had come not through vengeance, but through her alliance with the humans who had helped her find her strength again. And as the stars glittered overhead, Lyra smiled, knowing that the galaxy would remember her, and that her journey had only just begun.